Was their feeling that they should then help the rebels?
If you read closely, you'll find that the pattern of resistance on the part of the freedom fighters during that period, they had taken captives. They never made hostages of the whites that were in their territory. They only began to hold the whites as hostages when the American planes began to drop bombs on their villages. Their villages had no defense against bombs, so that when the bombs fell, it killed women, children, babies, everything. And since they were white pilots dropping these bombs, the freedom fighters felt that their best defense, or their only defense, was to hold white Americans in the village. And then the white pilots couldn't drop bombs on these villages. This is the only reason they held those captives, or the captives as hostages. When Shelby, seeing that he still couldn't gain any victories just with planes alone, began to hire the mercenaries from South Africa, and these mercenaries, being very vicious, began to shoot Congolese people indiscriminately. And then when they turned around and used their airplanes to bring in Belgian troops to drop them upon these villages, this is when the actions took place that the Western press projected as atrocities and called their own atrocities humanitarian acts. So the whole operation probably cost America the African continent.
It's a generally accepted fact then that the Americans were the ones that put Shelby back into power.
Oh yes, one very influential African leader told me that there was an African head of state that left this country not about a year or two ago, and sometime within the past 2 years or sometime within the past year, I forget which, and one of the high officials from the State Department flew all the way to London with him for no purpose other than to beg him all the way to use his influence upon other African heads of state to get them to accept Shelby as the prime minister. This was long before it was ever mentioned publicly that Shelby even might become the prime minister. And it was American maneuvering that put Shelby as prime minister in the Congo. In fact, it was American maneuvering that put Kasavubu in power. Because if you go back to 1960, when Lumumba and Kasavubu were fighting each other for control of the country, one day it would be Lumumba in power, the next day Kasavubu would be in power. It was like musical chairs, so to speak. And it was only after America interceded and brought Kasavubu to the United States and forced the United Nations to accept him as the rightful head of state in the Congo that he became recognized by the world as the head of state. And the first thing that Kasavubu did when he became recognized as the rightful head of state, when he went back to the Congo, he turned...
Things would have reached an equilibrium by themselves.
You mean back in those days?
Yeah, I'm thinking specifically in terms of the trouble that happened as soon as the Belgians pulled out.
As soon as the Belgians pulled out, they instigated trouble. They had to make it appear that the Congolese were too childlike to run their own affairs. And it is well recognized in many circles that it was Belgian, not only Belgian, but Western intrigue that kept things stirred up, because they had to make it appear that these African nations that were demanding independence would fall into chaos, and this was supposed to set back their efforts toward independence. It was just intrigue. And had this intrigue not come into play, then I think you'll find that the Congolese people could have solved their own problems. Lumumba had even visited this country seeking technicians from the Afro-Americans, black Americans, as well as others. He was making every effort to get his problem solved, but the Congo is too rich a prize for them to give up that easily. Not only is it valuable in terms of mineral wealth, but the Congo is so strategically located, geographically. If you look at it, you'll see that once a bona fide African government is in power there, then it makes it possible for that government to use its border with Angola to launch an attack against the Portuguese who are in Angola. And an independent Congo would soon bring about an independent Angola. And if Angola fell, then Southwest Africa, Bechuanaland, and Mozambique, and these other countries would also fall. By fall, I mean the Africans in those territories would become independent. And then it would put the African people right on the border with South Africa. And you'd have what is ultimate. You'd have what must come about ultimately anyway. And all of these Western interests are inseparably interwoven, and they're protecting their own interests. And South African interests are involved, as well as Southwest Africa, Southern Rhodesia, and Angola, and the Congo. All of these economic interests are involved there. And they use their power over the press to make the Western public think that it's a humanitarian reason for which they're in there. No one is dumb enough to accept that today.
Before we move back to the United States, let me ask you a final question on this African situation. In your eyes, or in the eyes of the people you've seen in the Muslim world, if we're talking now about U.S. prestige and U.S. influence, what would you see as the best way, if it's true that the U.S. has misused its role in Africa, what would you say the best way for the U.S. to act in the future would be?
Well, there's no country probably on earth that's in a better position to help if it were objective and motivated morally. But I saw some good contribution being made on the African continent by Americans. I also saw some bad contribution that would offset the good. And America, all Africa needs is education. Any underdeveloped, or not underdeveloped, because when you use the word underdeveloped, you're implying that there are areas that are developed. And when you use the West as an example of what development should be in that sense, there are too many things here that are negative, that negate the so-called development or level of development here in the West. But the nations on the African continent, or any place on this globe, that need help, need technical help, or that are behind, education would solve their problem. Education is the solution to almost every negative characteristic that exists in those particular areas. And America is in a good position to provide education, to provide technicians, to provide machinery, to provide technical help, personnel. She has that. She has perfected that. And if this type of contribution could be made based upon moral motivation, then it would get the same results that they are now trying to get through political motivation. But because the contribution that America makes all over the world right now is motivated politically rather than morally, she actually undoes her own, she negates her own objective, because this political motivation makes everything she does suspect. People can see it, they can sense it, they can feel it. So she still doesn't accomplish what she's after. But if she could become morally motivated, which I doubt that she can, then she'd get good results.
Do you see any danger of this aid we were talking about, of this help? Do you see any danger in the implications that would occur if the aid, say, came from the communist side of the fence?
People who need aid don't care whether they come from communists or capitalists. And this is, I think, what Americans don't realize. This thing about condemning an African country because it gets aid from Russia or China, the Africans laugh at that. Just to give you an example, here's America aiding Shombi, a rascal, a murderer, you know. She aids him, gives him everything he wants, and then she has the audacity to get angry when the people who are the victims of Shombi's murderous operations turn to China or someplace else for aid. People who are downtrodden and oppressed don't think in terms of a man's politics or any of that when they're looking for aid.
Let's grant then that the aid is needed. I'm asking you, though, would there be any danger, you think, that the same influence claimed on Shombi by the United States would be exerted by the communist nations on the countries they helped? In other words, a bad political influence eventually, granted that they need the aid no matter who they get it from.
President Nasser in Egypt, which is in northeast Africa, is one of the best examples of the African thinking when it comes to being capable of taking aid and at the same time not being in the pocket of the one who has given the aid. Because he has taken all of the aid Russia can give in building of the Aswan and other projects that are going on there, and at the same time he has put more communists in jail in his country than has been done in France or Italy, countries that are allies of the United States. And I don't see how condemnation can be given, or the finger of condemnation can be pointed at an African nation for taking aid from a communist country, and the finger of condemnation not be pointed at a European country which has half of its population sometime voting the communist ticket during election time. But they don't use the same yardstick for measurement there, and it makes Africans become suspicious.
You don't think these Africans would be in any danger then in the future of, let's say, communist infiltration as has been claimed by U.S. infiltration?
I think an African is an African,
no matter what.
And he thinks especially today, the African's concept of even capitalism, socialism, communism, any kind of ism that you find, even the African concept of, take as an example, socialism. The African concept of socialism is an African concept. It's not something that's identical to concept of socialism in Europe. The Africans are thinking in terms of what is good for Africa. And I doubt that you'll find any African country that's willing to supplant one ruler for another ruler. If there's going to be a ruler, he'll be African.
All right, let's move now across the ocean back to the United States for a minute and look at what are some of the appeals that the Muslim movement has for the American Negro.
Well, first I want to point out that it's good that we went into what's happening on the African continent before coming back over here, because what is happening on the African continent is having a direct impact upon what's happening in the black communities here in America. The mood of the African continent is inseparable from the mood of the black man here on the American continent. They both are beating to the same tune today, same heartbeat. And the Muslim movement, I might point out here too, I'm involved in two movements. The Muslim movement, that is the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which is not in any way connected with Elijah Muhammad's Black Muslim movement. We have set up the Muslim Mosque for the purpose of giving people who are interested in Islam an opportunity to learn more about the religion of Islam, who want to practice the Muslim religion. But the problem of the black American goes above and beyond religion. So we established another group known as the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which is not religious at all, and to which any black American can belong who is interested in participating in an action program designed to eliminate the political, the social, and the economic evils that our people are confronted by.
What are some of the things this movement does?
Well, one of the first, we feel that the problem of the black man in America has ceased to be a Negro problem or an American problem, but has now reached the point where it has to be considered as a world problem or a human problem, a problem for humanity. We don't regard it anymore as a problem of civil rights, but a problem of human rights. And as such, as long as it was regarded as a problem of civil rights, it was domestic, it was confined to the domestic jurisdiction of the United States government, and we had to rely upon the congressmen and senators who were racist, many of whom were racist, southern racists and northern racists, and the Supreme Court to bring us some kind of redress to our grievances. This is at the civil rights level. And we don't feel that the government or those in the United States government are morally capable of looking at the problem objectively enough to come up with meaningful efforts to solve it. So we feel that at the human rights level, which takes it above and beyond the jurisdiction of the United States government, it opens the way for us to take our grievances away from the courts of the United States and the Senate and the Congress of the United States into the UN and charge the racists that control this government with violating our human rights, because ours is a human rights violation rather than a civil rights violation. So one of the first objectives of the Organization of Afro-American Unity is to make our problem become recognized as a world problem, a human problem, that can be fought at the international level with allies from all over the world, rather than to keep it confined to the domestic level of civil rights, and then we can only turn to allies right within the country to help us in our struggle.
Do you believe that a large part of the American government is in the hands of racists?
Oh, yes. Washington, D.C. is controlled by racists. I can prove it. If you analyze this governmental system, it's controlled by committees. I think it's 16 senatorial committees and 20 congressional committees. And these committees are the ones that control and determine the foreign and domestic direction of the country. 10 of the 16 senatorial committees have Southern segregationists as their chairman. 13 of the 20 congressional committees have Southern segregationists as their chairman, which means that 23 of the 36 committees that govern the foreign and domestic direction of this country have chairmen who are Southern segregationists, racists themselves. These men are in the most influential positions of government. The reason that they are in these positions as committee chairman is because they have the seniority system. And these men are from areas of the country where the black man is not permitted to vote. So this enables them to stay in the Congress and the Senate based upon the whims of the white racists in their particular areas, rather than upon their desire to represent the entire element, the black as well as the white. So yes, it's definitely controlled by the racist element.
Well, let's say then that some of them are segregationists. Does this necessarily mean that all their committees are going to follow these types of policies?
Well, they do. Anybody will tell you that nothing can go through, for instance, the Judiciary Committee without the approval of Senator Eastland of Mississippi. Nothing goes through the Armed Forces Committee without the approval of, I think, Russell of Georgia. You have Fulbright of Arkansas, who is over the, I think, foreign relations or something of that sort. These men are, in fact, when you name the most well-known senators in Washington, usually they are well-known because of their position over one of these committees. And most of these persons are Southern segregationists. They're racist. They even voted against Lyndon B. Johnson in the recent election. But still, they occupy these positions of power. Senator Long, the grandson or son of Huey Long from Louisiana. The Southern element or Southern bloc in Washington, D.C. is so powerful that even though the state of Louisiana went against Lyndon B. Johnson and went against the Democratic Party, still Long, a Democratic senator who also went against Johnson, was put in as the whip there in the present administration.
Well, let's look at some of the other leaders. Let's say the people like Dirksen.
Dirksen was with Goldwater, a Goldwater backer. He was one of the first supporters of Goldwater.
Yeah, but he was also did play an important part in the civil rights bill that was put through.
Some deals were made.
Well, deals, maybe.
They were wheeling and dealing.
Let's say they were wheeling
with the
and
rights of 22 million black Americans at stake.
But despite their wheeling and dealing, something was done.
Such as?
The civil rights bill. Which
no, they passed a bill which wasn't necessary in the first place.
Why don't you think it was necessary?
If you don't need civil rights bills for these refugees who come to this country from behind the Iron Curtain, as soon as they get here, they enjoy full status, all constitutional benefits. They need no new legislation. But when it comes to the black man who was born here, when his constitutional benefits at stake, he needs new legislation, new bills. My contention is that if the Constitution in itself is sufficient, you don't need new legislation. If it is sufficient for foreigners who come here, then it should be sufficient for the black man who was born here. Plus, the Civil Rights Bill involves new legislation, which means new laws, which are no good unless they can be enforced. And if the Supreme Court desegregation decision came into being as a law in 1954 and has been implemented less than 10% in the following 10 years, they can't even enforce that law in New York City, where I live. They're having problems trying to integrate the schools or desegregate the schools. And my contention is that if you can't pass a law handed down by the Supreme Court in New York City, supposedly one of the most progressive cities in the country, why, it's a farce to come up with new legislation thinking that this is going to solve the problem of our people in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and these other less progressive areas.
What do you suggest then as an alternative to this, since it seems that for the past 400 years nothing else has worked?
Definitely nothing else has worked. My opinion is that a complete new analysis of the problem has to be gone into, and this analysis cannot be done by those politicians in Washington, D.C., because they're just politicians. Anything they do is for political expediency. But the students, the youth, the young people in this country probably are the only ones who are inability to be in a position to be objective enough to analyze the problem as it actually is. Number one, if you look at the problem as an American, you never can see it. Because as an American, you are being subjective, and you're actually analyzing yourself, which a doctor won't even try and diagnose his own sickness. And to look at the problem as an American blinds you to the reality of the problem. When you look at a problem as an American, if your analysis is against America, then you can't accept that analysis. Even though your analysis might be for a human being or for human beings, if it's against an American or if it's against America, when you look at it as an American, you can't accept it. But if you look at the problem as a human being, as a human problem, if you look at it as human beings, as a human problem, if your analysis demands a solution that is for human beings, even though it's against America, you still have to accept it as the analysis and the solution, because you're now interested more in human beings than you are Americans. My contention is that too many people in this country try and approach the problem as Americans, and they're too objective, they're too involved in it, and they can't see it as it actually is.
Well, is there any way to go about changing the situation within our constitutional framework? It's all fine and well to say this is the way it should be, but what I'm groping for now is...
When you say constitutional framework...
In other words, I'm assuming that we're going to keep the American system, the constitutional system, basically the way it is, not excluding amendments, but not excluding...
The Constitution was put together by men who were slave owners themselves at the time the Constitution was put together. And if you read it very closely, there's nothing in the Constitution that in any way encourages or recognizes the right of the black man, who was a slave at that time, to be recognized and accepted as a human being. In fact, if my memory of the Constitution serves me right, somewhere in there it classifies the black man or the slave as 3/5 of a man. He wasn't regarded as a full...
This is for voting rights.
Well, that's still voting rights is the most basic right. And if the Constitution itself didn't recognize the voting right of the black man, and it didn't give the black man voting rights equal to the white man. The black men were classified 3/5 of blacks were equal to...
This is something that's since been taken out.
How?
I mean that the official...
How was it taken out?
The 3/5.
By the amendment?
No, let's put it this way. It's something that's being... We'll have to see in the next few years what...
This is what I'm trying to make you see. A black man, this generation of black people in this country, will never wait for no next few years. And this is what whites don't realize. The former generations of blacks were so conditioned mentally that they felt it necessary to wait until the power structure deemed them to be qualified to be accepted into the mainstream of things. But world conditions, and this is where your African conversation of a few moments ago comes into importance. The emergence of Africa on the world scene as an independent power automatically makes the black man in this country take a new look at himself as a human being and his role in the family of human beings. And he just doesn't see where he should have to sit around and wait for a segment of humanity which is actually a minority. The European or white segment is a minority of humanity. And we don't see where we should have to sit around and wait year in and year out for these whites who consider themselves civilized and who consider themselves the head of a political system supposedly designed to recognize the rights of a human being. We don't see where it's necessary for us to sit around and wait for another 2 or 3 years.
Well, if this political system then fails to solve the problem, what do you suggest as a means to solve it? What framework?
If this system fails, you're going to have to replace it with another system. If this system is not going to respect the man as a human being, and we are living at a time now when all human beings are developing their own independent intellect so that they can think independently as human beings and tell what they should be receiving as human beings and what contribution they should be making as human beings. If the society itself in which they live doesn't offer that, then I think you're going to find a very serious conflict of interest developing.
So then you would advocate a basic change in the whole governmental framework in the United States?
I advocate anything that will produce a society in which all human beings are recognized and respected as human beings. Anything necessary to bring about that condition, that's what I advocate. And by any means necessary, that's what I advocate.
Including violent means?
Whenever a man, a human being, is being criminally, not only legally, or rather illegally, but criminally mistreated, he's within his rights to use whatever means are necessary to bring an end immediately to that criminal mistreatment.
I'm not at all condoning what goes on in many parts of the country.
I don't think you are.
But I'm asking if you feel this is the weapon that should be used, if there's not a more peaceful weapon, a more...
If a peaceful weapon could be used to correct the situation, I'd be as much for it as anybody else. But I'm a realist. And I've watched this peaceful approach. America doesn't use the peaceful approach in South Vietnam. She didn't use the peaceful approach in the Congo. She didn't use it in dealing with Castro in Cuba. She has never used a peaceful approach. Not when her interests are at stake. And I don't fault her for that. I think any intelligent being is going to use whatever means necessary when his interests are at stake. And all I'm saying is that when the black American really begins to think with his own mind, he's going to be just as human as all other human beings. And he's going to think in terms of reacting as all other human beings. And he will see that he should be nonviolent only when his enemy is nonviolent. If he's dealing with a peaceful enemy, then be peaceful. If he's dealing with a nonviolent enemy, then be nonviolent. But don't be peaceful when you're in the clutches of an enemy that's not peaceful, or don't be nonviolent when you're in the clutches of an enemy that's not nonviolent, and don't be merciful when you're in the clutches of an enemy that's not merciful. And I think if you study the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council and these other vicious, racist groups in this country, it's absolutely insane for us, for our people, to think that we can contend with them in a peaceful, loving, forgiving way.
Is this something that you see as corresponding to the basic Muslim doctrines? Is fighting violence with violence?
No, in the Quran it teaches. The Quran says, fight against those who fight against you. This is what I love about this is one of the things that I love about the Muslim religion. It's a religion of peace, but at the same time, you see the intelligence of it, because it says, fight against those who fight against you. Don't initiate acts of aggression. Don't attack people indiscriminately. But at the same time, the religion of Islam gives one the right to fight when he's fought against. No, this is in no way in conflict with Muslim religion.
Do you see now, looking just at the United States, where we have, is it 20 million Negroes now?
22 million.
22 million versus the total population of about 180 million. Do you see any possible danger in this idea of violence escalating?
No. Yes, it might escalate. But when a man wants freedom, he doesn't care anything about escalation. And this is what you have to, again, you go right back to the human being. When a human being becomes a human being, his most valuable commodity is his freedom. His freedom is worth more than his life. And if he can't have freedom, what good is his life? If he lives in a society that denies him freedom, that it castrates him. It castrates him psychologically, which eventually leads almost to a physical castration. I, for one, feel that in the present world context, you'll find that we aren't a 22 million minority. We're only a minority when we think within the confines of the limitations of the American stage. We're a minority then because we're standing on a white stage, so to speak. But when you realize that the world has gotten so small that there's really no such thing as an American stage or a European stage or an African stage, there's a world stage. It's almost a one world, whether we like it or not. And on that one world stage where we stand today, we're not a minority. In fact, if anything, we're part of the dark majority.
All right. Granted that, I'd like to come back again to the United States, just dealing with this problem, though I realize it is related, of course, with the entire problem all over the world. This question of violence has become more and more important, especially as the summers progress. It seems that the summers are equivalent with violence in many of the cities. There have been many complaints among many people that some of the violence is not necessarily directed at civil rights, human rights, but is more an excuse by some people for a vandalism type.
That analysis itself is an excuse by the society itself for its own failure to have eliminated the negative conditions that exist in black communities. When you find the criminal conditions that exist in the black community and have existed for so long, it's only natural to expect the degree of frustration to mount in those communities to such degree that an explosion is inevitable. And in these explosions, one doesn't plan to be polite or to direct his energy, his exploding energy, in any one direction. This is something to expect in any explosion. That's a sociological explosion, or an explosion that stems from social conditions that are criminal. You don't expect everybody in that area to explode intelligently and legally and lawfully and politely. You have all types of elements in that community.
This is one of the major problems, is that there are many explosions going on, and what I'm wondering is if it would not be easier to prevent the explosion than try to pick up all the pieces after it happened.
It would be more intelligent to prevent the explosion rather than to pick up the pieces after it happens. But again, you're dealing with a power structure that consists primarily of politicians. And instead of trying to remove the causes of the explosion, they deal with the conditions, so to speak, and leave the causes there. When the black community becomes explosive, they get some big Negro leader and send him in to quiet the community down. They never remove the causes that create the conditions, but they have these little century-old methods that always have failed in instances like this.
Would you say that the work being done now in the South by people that are from some of the other civil rights organizations like SNCC and CORE and the NAACP towards voter registration, towards education of these people, is this at all useful? Does this fit into your idea?
Education is first. Voter registration is second.
But you do see this as
helping. Yes, education is the first step toward solving any problem that exists anywhere on this earth which involves people who are oppressed. As a rule, the oppressed people lack education, and this has affected their ability to cope with their problem themselves. And their inability to cope with their own problem places them at the mercy of someone else who's supposed to come up with a solution for their problem, but who can't without a conflict of interest. It's only when the masses of people can approach their own problem that their problem will be solved.
Where then do you see these other civil rights organizations like CORE and SNCC and the NAACP as fitting into this overall picture in the United States?
Well, I think you'll find that even right at this moment, James Farmer, the national director of CORE, is in Africa, traveling the African continent. And he sounds more like, since he's been over, I've heard a couple of broadcasts that he's made, he sounds more like Jomo Kenyatta and Lumumba than he does like James Farmer, just since he's been over there. And an article in the U.S. News and World Report magazine a couple of weeks ago pointed out that the entire Negro civil rights leadership is beginning to voice publicly the fact that the black man's problem in this country is inseparable from the problem of the black man on the African continent, and that we should seek allies from the African nations, among the independent African nations, in our own struggle to try and get some kind of correcting of our problem. Now, when the civil rights leaders are forced to think like this. A year ago, they didn't think like this. They didn't mention anything in their problem in the context of world affairs or in the context of the African struggle. But now they're being forced to think like this, and as the two problems are linked up and made inseparable, and the black people in this country see African statesmen also speaking out in their behalf, this will give the black populace in this country more courage and more energy, and they'll press harder. And then one thing will lead another, and you can get your escalating that you were talking about a moment ago.
So then you do see some of these leaders bringing back these ideas of violence versus violence, if that's what it needs.
I don't use the word violence ever. If you don't initiate an attack upon someone, if you react to defend yourself, I don't call your reaction violence. And all I say in this context of violence is that our people never will initiate acts of aggression indiscriminately against whites. But I do say that the black man in this country, if he's attacked, he should strike back. Yes, I say that even if it costs him his life, he should strike back. He should in no time, no matter what the odds are, let someone come and issue a beating upon him when he's doing nothing other than seeking his rights as a human being. No, he should fight back if it costs him his life. And if he has to take life in fighting back, he shouldn't even hesitate to do so. If someone is trying to take his life, he shouldn't hesitate to take the lives of those clan-like elements that are trying to take his life. No, I don't see it.
Difference I see in looking at defending your own life, which I'm certain most people, most rational people, most places in the world would not object to defending your life against someone that's trying to take it. But what I was thinking more in terms of is the large-scale riots versus picketing that now seems to be spreading over much of the country. This type of violence where it's a destructive violence. It's a violence that, true enough, may have been spurred on by things that have been done by them, but yet it's not really defending themselves in this manner. They're using violence to gain their means now.
Well, if you'll notice, instead of striking at the humans who inflict this brutality upon them, they strike at buildings, property. This has been the pattern. When I was in Africa, doing all of the riots last summer. And many of the Africans asked me the question, why do they tear up their own neighborhood? And I pointed out that it isn't their own neighborhood. They don't own the homes that they live in. The homes are owned by white landlords who live someplace else. They call them slumlords. The stores in the community are owned by white merchants who live someplace else. Usually, all of these absentee landlords and absentee merchants are considered liberals, you know. They contribute to the NAACP and things of that sort, but they also play a major role in the community exploitation. And when the black community erupts, it looks upon this outsider as nothing but an exploiter. He doesn't own the house in the community to contribute good housing to the community. He doesn't own the store in the black community to contribute a higher quality merchandise at a cheaper price. Almost the entire existence of these outsiders is wrapped up in the image of exploitation. So, and the policeman in the black community is not looked upon by the black citizen as someone who's there to protect their interests. They look upon him as someone who's in the black community to protect the stores of the white merchant, or to protect the houses of the white landlord. And he's looked upon almost as an enemy army. Proof of which he's the one in uniform who's used against the people of the community when they're trying to seek redress to just grievances, or when they're trying to enforce rights which the courts have said that they have. So that the pattern in the past has been not to strike back at the policeman who crushes their skull with his club, or whose dog tears the flesh from their limbs. They haven't struck back at him, but their tendency has been to strike at the property of the outsider that's in the neighborhood. And then the power structure interprets that as thievery and vandalism and things of that sort, because they haven't yet analyzed the motive of the man who's involved in that. And their refusal to analyze it makes them miss the boat. It's not vandalism. It's not a few criminals who are taking advantage of a situation. No, it is the reaction, the explosion, the frustration that is experienced by people who feel that for too long they have been held down by a system who gives them nothing but promises that never materialize, no matter whose mouth the promise is made from.
Do you see the Organization for Afro-Asian Unity as
Afro-American Unity.
I'm sorry, Afro-American Unity as a possible means to reach the international level, solve some of the problems on the international level before the violence erupts, before the explosion occurs?
Well, let me say this first. I'm not interested in violence. See, when whites approach the problem, they approach it to avoid violence. This is the wrong approach. This is the wrong objective. This is the wrong motive. If a problem is criminal, it should be approached to eliminate the criminal aspects of it. Violence having nothing to do with it, or the threat of violence having nothing to do with it. But when you help a man who's been criminally mistreated, just to keep him from exploding violently, it's the wrong motive. And this is what I have been trying to make the white citizens see. So anything that we do is not to avoid violence. What we do is to correct a problem that has existed too long. Now, if it takes more violence to correct it, we're not even afraid of that. If it can be done peacefully, then we're hopeful of that. But violence, or the threat of violence, or the fear of violence, no way enters into our plan of operation at all. But the Organization of Afro-American Unity has a two-pronged attack. Number one, to link our problem with the world struggle and get allies towards solving our problem at the world level by making our problem a world problem, a human problem. That's the external approach, the international approach. At a national level, it's our intention to become actively involved with all other groups who are genuinely trying to come up with programs designed to solve the problem. Whereas the political aspect is concerned, voter registration is good as long as it's coupled with voter education. We think that our people should be educated into the knowledge of the science of politics, so that once they're registered, they won't be exploitable by crooked politicians. So that we go along with voter registration, but we also believe in voter education. We also believe that in areas of this country where students are sent in to help black people get registered, we feel that units should be sent along with them to protect them from the organized attacks of the Ku Klux Klan that these units should be qualified, capable, and equipped to retaliate and speak the same kind of language that the Klan speaks, so that they will communicate and understand one another. In any area of programming that's genuinely designed to bring immediate results for the masses, not a hand-picked few, then we go along with that.
Well, one final question then. Do you foresee the day when the white man and the black man, when all races all over the world can live together in peace?
When humanity looks upon itself not as black men, white men, brown men, red men, and yellow men, but as human beings, then they will sit down and live together in peace. Not when they look upon themselves as Americans or Europeans or Asians or Africans. Then they can sit down and live with each other in peace.
24 persons, most of them youngsters, were arrested today in the second day of rioting in Brooklyn over alleged school segregation. Some 300 Negro teenagers and youths ran wild through downtown Brooklyn, battling police, smashing windows, and terrorizing pedestrians. Board of Education President James Donovan warns that leaders of the school boycotts which led to the riots would be arrested, along with any children who did not attend classes. Donovan called the boycott leaders Pied Pipers who were seeking personal publicity. What is a black Muslim besides a Negro, and what is the movement? Is it a bona fide religion or just a terror organization? Tonight on Stan Bernard Contact, we're discussing black nationalism and the black Muslim movement, and my guests tonight, Malcolm X, also in the studio, Aubrey Barnett, a former black Muslim official from Boston. He's also split with the organization. And my third guest, Gordon Hall, an expert on extremist organizations. Malcolm, it wasn't too long ago that you were preaching separation, black supremacy. How do you equate that now with what you're saying today?
There's not one person who is a Muslim who believes in Elijah Muhammad today who believes in him more strongly than I did. When I was with him, I believed in him 100%. And it was my strong belief in him that made me go along with everything he taught. And I think if you check back on my representation of him while I was with him, I represented him 100%.
What is your status now, Malcolm?
How do you mean?
Right now.
I'm a Muslim. You must understand that the black Muslim movement, although it claimed to be a religious movement based upon Islam, it was never acceptable to the Orthodox Muslim world. Although at the same time it attracted the most militant, the most dissatisfied of the black community into it. And by them getting into it, and the movement itself not having a real action program, it comprised a number of persons who were extremely young and militant, but who could not, and who were activists by nature, but who couldn't participate in things. So the inactivity of the movement caused a great deal of dissatisfaction until finally dissension broke in division, and those of us who left regrouped into a Muslim movement based upon Orthodox Islam.
So now that you've broken away, are you in a membership fight now with Elijah Muhammad?
No, I have never at any time involved myself in a membership fight with Elijah Muhammad. In fact, if you go back to the release that I made public at the time of my official departure, I pointed out that I was in no way trying to take away the followers of Elijah Muhammad, but that I myself was going to become a Muslim, but would work among the 22 million non-Muslim Negroes and try to establish some kind of program that would be beneficial to the black American period.
There were a lot of numbers that were thrown around some time ago. I guess it was 2 years ago or so, and the numbers said something like 100,000 Muslims across the United States. You, in your article, Aubrey Barnett, talk about these numbers. And you ask a question at one point. You say, how large was our membership? The most accurate estimate I ever heard of our strength in Boston came during a radio debate between Gordon Hall, a specialist on extremist organizations, and Malcolm X. What now, when you talk about numbers today? And you, Aubrey, mention in your article, you say something like 55 members in all of Boston, 57 in another place.
I say
small membership numbers.
I'm speaking of the present membership of the mosque right now. In Boston, they have probably 55 male members. Springfield, probably 35 or 40. Providence, Rhode Island, maybe 10 or 15 members. The membership has just about dwindled in half. And before I comment on the actual sense of the movement at its peak, I'd like to add something to what Malcolm had just said, that not only did the black Muslim movement attract dissatisfied Negroes, it attracted Negroes who were, contrary to the popular public belief, they did attract some Negroes who were doing very well in the world, but Negroes who thought that the black Muslims had a program for improving the condition of the Negro in America. I was one of those Negroes. And I thought the Muslims, black Muslims, had a program for economic upliftment, a program of moral upliftment. I thought the Muslims had a program for combating juvenile delinquency.
And you saw this as a myth now?
I see it as a myth now.
I see. Gordon, you have been a critic of all extremist organizations. You sort of pinpointed the strength of the Muslim organization. And you say that the strength is basically a myth with these 100,000 numbers. How did you arrive at your own figures?
Well, I do this work full-time to begin with, and I've done this work for close to 20 years. And when you follow extremists around, whether they're Negro extremists or white extremists, if they make a lot of noise, all out of proportion to their numbers, just as currently the Negro nationalists in the New York area are making noise all out of proportion to their numbers. And I think the real tip-off, Stan, came when Elijah was supposed to speak at the Boston Arena a few summers ago. I think it was July of 1962, and I flew back from the speaking day to Minneapolis and told the press that they couldn't possibly fill the Boston Arena, which seats 7,200 people, even if they brought in all of the people from the other mosques around the eastern seaboard, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and so on. I also predicted that Elijah Muhammad would not show up, that he's an incoherent old man. He does not speak well. He doesn't make any sense in his public appearances. And I felt that Malcolm probably would carry the load that day, and it worked out precisely that way. This was a prediction long before they even opened the doors in the arena. And then, lo and behold, despite all the efforts to allow the white public in, plus all the sisters and brothers and all the fiddle-faddle about the whole show, they couldn't even fill downstairs in the arena.
And they brought in 3,000, I think, was the figure, right?
Yes, something like that. And that was the clear tip-off to me that this thing was built on quicksand, that they've never had any members, really. And this is pretty much the history of extremist movements in general, that they make noise all out of proportion to their numbers. This was based really on the reality of the situation and not listening to all the grandiose statements made by men like Malcolm X.
What year was that?
I don't have the figures with me, Malcolm. I think it was the summer of '62, if I remember.
Aubrey,
You were the main speaker.
You mentioned that in your article, and you say there were 3,000 there, and Malcolm, you were the main speaker.
I know a lot of white people there, too.
No, there were about 200, which was a lot for those days. But I think you'll find that the Muslim movement reached its peak in strength in 1960, 59 and 60. And it began to taper off in 61 and in 62.
Do you agree with Aubrey's figures that the peak strength was about 13 to 15,000? That be your estimate as well of the total Muslim movement?
No, the peak in 1959 and 60 was reached. But it began to go down after Elijah Muhammad took a trip abroad, plus became involved in other personal problems. And the movement itself began to deteriorate only after Elijah Muhammad put members of his own family in positions of authority, which weakened the structure and caused internal bickering and division, and eventually the movement just petered out.
And I think the whole point of this last discussion between Aubrey and Malcolm and myself would be to point out that the three of us agree that of a peak figure of, say, 15,000, regardless of the year, whether it was 1960 or 59, this is far below what the press had been estimating.
See, Eric Lincoln came up with a figure of 100,000.
Because he doesn't study extremists. That's why he came up with that figure.
No, I have to contend with that, and I won't go along with what you're saying.
In what way? Malcolm, in what way?
See, Eric Lincoln is the person who was probably first to mention a number in regards to black Muslims. But you will never find any figure given out at any time in any way, not by me, concerning the numerical strength of the Muslims. I have never stated. My standing answer was that the best part of the tree is the root. And I never defined the extent of the tree beyond that.
Malcolm,
I don't quite follow.
The thing you have to consider, Mr. Hall, is when you say that when you study extremist groups, usually they're very small and don't have much of an impact upon the public or drawing among the public. Whether you're in the north, south, east, or west here in the States, where the nationalists are concerned, usually nationalists have an anti-press, whereas the civil rights groups, or the accepted civil rights groups, usually the press, the city government, all of the machinery that has to do with molding public opinion goes along with civil rights groups. And whenever they're giving something, they have everything going for them toward promoting what they're giving. But when it comes to the nationalists, usually you'll find that they have to almost fight their way into print in advance if they're going to give something. And despite that, those obstacles and that type of organized opposition, still you find the nationalist groups, especially in the New York area, command a large following. I'll give you an example. This coming Sunday at 2 o'clock at the Audubon Ballroom, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which I'm presently involved in, which is considered nationalist, are having a rally, and you are welcome to attend that. White, black, brown, red, yellow, green, or whatever else you have. And I think you'll find that despite the fact that we get no help whatsoever from the press, that we're able here in the New York area to attract larger crowds to our rallies than any other kind of rally that's given, and they are given the complete support of the press.
But that doesn't prove anything, Malcolm, because Harlem is a big place. You'll get a lot of Negroes in. You'll get curious whites. That's not your membership.
No, nobody.
Just as when the Grand Dragon of the Klan speaks on campus, he will outdraw the vice president.
He doesn't have to have membership to still be the influencing factor in the South. You can't tell me that the Klan is a handful of people in Alabama and then the whole government is supposed to be behind Martin Luther King, and a handful of Klansmen are keeping Dr. King in jail and marching Negro children down the road.
I'm not saying that at all.
Well, then you can't say that extremist groups are not effective and do not represent an influencing factor in this society.
The Muslims and the nationalists in the Negro community are not an important factor.
I have a question after this point.
But the Klan is an important factor in the white community.
It has been historically, yes.
Malcolm, you say attempts have been made on your life, and that was at this afternoon's press conference. You say 5 different attempts recently. How were they attempted?
Yes, more than 5.
Of course, there was the bombing of the house, which you know about. That occurred Sunday.
Yes, first I would like to point out about that bombing of the house, because the press has also been used during the past week to imply that I bombed my own house. I would like to point out right here and now that I have no life insurance. My wife has no life insurance. I have 4 baby girls, none of whom have life insurance. We don't have health insurance. We don't have fire insurance. We have no kind of insurance whatsoever. And the only group that stood to gain anything from the bombing of that house was the Black Muslim movement, in which the insurance is in their name. And I really felt hurt that the press would allow itself to be used to give the public the impression that I would throw a bomb or light a fire to a home in which my wife and family are asleep. The Deputy Chief Fire Marshal, I think his name is Vincent Canty, pointed out to me in the presence of witnesses on that same night that a fireman picked up a bottle of gasoline from my living room that had not exploded. And because this bottle of gasoline was in a whiskey bottle, this fireman placed that bottle on the dresser in my baby's room, thinking that it was a bottle of whiskey. And when my wife came in and saw the bottle there, she asked the fireman, what was it? And the fireman said it was whiskey. And well, we know that there's no whiskey in our house. And so she touched it and said, this isn't whiskey, this is something inflammable. And then they took it out. Now, despite that, the Deputy Fire Chief Marshal, having this knowledge, and the police having this knowledge, still this knowledge is kept back from the press, and in the vacuum that exists, then this man James down at 116th Street steps in and tries to give the impression that all of this was done by me. And I think that it is a worse injustice on the part of the press and the police and the firemen to let such impression be given, even than the people who threw the bombs in the house themselves.
Aubrey, you were attacked in Boston by a group that you say were members of a Muslim Goon squad. How did that come about?
I think I should be angry with Malcolm, because I think, in a way, Malcolm was responsible for my being attacked. The reason I was attacked, because the Black Muslim movement, losing strength, had to build an enemy. And the enemy they projected was the black nationalists. Now, because I had left the mosque and put the black Muslims behind, they branded me as a black nationalist. Even though I had left the mosque some time before Malcolm ever thought of leaving the mosque, I was still accused of being a follower of Malcolm, although they should have turned around and said Malcolm was following me since I left first. But anyway, I can testify to the brutality of the black Muslims, because I was viciously attacked by the black Muslims. I was hospitalized for a week, and at home, in bed for another week. I had a fractured rib, a fractured ankle, 2 fractured vertebrae, and internal injuries. And the reason I was attacked was primarily because I had the audacity to quit the Black Muslim movement. I might point out, as far as the Black Muslims manufacturing stories, one of the most fantastic stories I ever heard was the Black Muslims' testimony in the trial, in which they were, incidentally, were all found guilty of assault and battery on myself and the other fellow who was with me. Yes, sir. I was one of the first cases in the country where a black Muslim ex-member had pressed charges against the black Muslims for being beat up. I'm not the first one who was beat up. I'm the first one who had the courage to take them into court. During this trial, they made some outrageous charges. First of all, they charged that John Timus and myself attacked the mosque. 2 men attacked the mosque.
You were a mighty 135 pounds.
I weigh 130 pounds soaking wet. But anyway, John Timus and myself attacked the mosque where there may be, according to the black Muslim members, they would have you believe there's 1,000 members there. But there are only probably 55, but 2 men against 55 is pretty good odds. But this is the story they gave, that I attacked the mosque, and during the course of the trial, after I was attacked, I was taken to the city hospital by the Boston police. I stayed there for about 2 hours, and then the police took me to I had myself transferred to the Beth Israel Hospital. So the lawyer, during the trial, said that I got together with the Beth Israel Hospital and faked all of these injuries. I faked the x-rays showing my fractured ribs. I faked the x-rays showing the...
Who was the lawyer?
The lawyer was Edward Jacko.
From New York City?
New York City.
From Harlem?
Yeah.
You mean Edward Jacko came to Boston and accused you of faking these charges?
Yes, apparently he wasn't very familiar with the Beth Israel Hospital because it's one of the biggest hospitals in Boston, and how I ever got together with the Beth Israel Hospital to fake these records is beyond me. And why the Beth Israel didn't take him up on that is beyond me also. But they will fabricate any charges, make up the wildest stories.